Hi everyone and welcome to module number 7. In this one we're going to talk about the voice leading for a Neapolitan sixth. So we've talked about the voice leading for borrowed chords. Now we're moving on to the other kind of new chromatic chord we talked about, which was the Neapolitan sixth. So just like before, we're going to learn how to create and resolve Neapolitan sixth chords with voice leading. We'll be able to realize figured-based examples with Neapolitan sixth chords, and we'll do some practicing analyzing Neapolitan sixth chords with Roman numerals. Okay, so going to talk about a quick little review here of incorporating borrowed notes. So you know from last time that in order to create a smooth effect, which is often the goal of the style of music, any chromatic notes or borrowed notes or whatever you want to call them must be introduced and resolved correctly. And so one technique to do this is to incorporate these notes as a non-chord tone pattern. So like as a chromatic passing tone or a chromatic upper neighbor tone. Okay? And in some cases we saw you could even do it through turning what would normally be a half step into a whole step. So the same thing applies when you're creating a Neapolitan sixth chord. Okay? So they're usually heard in a minor key, so we'll start there. So here are some techniques for introducing the flat 2 into the music that you're writing. So one way to do it is just like the borrowed notes, you can use it as a chromatic upper neighbor to the first scale degree. So the lowered second is obviously only a half step above the first scale degree, so we can introduce that easily by using it as an upper neighbor to that first scale degree. So here you have a C natural moving up to a D flat, and that creates the Neapolitan sixth chord that's in that second chord there. Okay, so this is what that sounds like. Okay, so very smooth, but you know, it's kind of a balance between the striking nature of that chord and the smoothness of just using that upper chromatic neighbor. Okay, another way to do it is to introduce the flat 2 as a descending whole step from the third scale degree. Okay, so normally this is the key of C minor. So normally the distance between the third degree and the second degree is a half step, but we can change that to be a whole step and create another smooth way of introducing the flat 2. Okay, I'll do that again. Okay, notice the first chord there is a 6 chord in first inversion, which is pretty common to use to get to the flat 2 chord, the Neapolitan sixth. Okay, so that's the two main ways you can introduce the flat 2. I'm sure there are others, but these are the two I think most common ways, either as a chromatic upper neighbor from the first scale degree, so going up a half step, or as introducing it as a whole step from the third scale degree. Okay. And of course, you always want to resolve them correctly, and they always resolve down by step. And I put that in quotes because this is sometimes a half step, and sometimes it's a whole step. Okay? And it doesn't always look like a step on the staff. So it depends on which chord you're going to. So in that first chord, that first example, we're ending this progression on a 5-7 chord. Okay, whenever you end on a dominant harmony, like this one does, a 5 chord, the flat 2 will actually move all the way down to the leading tone of the key. Okay, and it looks like a third on the staff, but it sounds like a whole step. Okay, and in fact it's a diminished third, but because it just sounds like a whole step, it's not really that jarring. And this is kind of the characteristic sound of a Neapolitan progression. So here's what this sounds like. So we're going up from a C to a D flat upper neighbor, and then resolving that down to the B natural. Okay. And so that's how the lowered second degree leads to the leading tone, and you use the leading tone if you are going to a 5 chord. But you can also go to a 1-6-4 chord or cadential 6/4 chord, which is what happens in the second example. So in this example, that D flat will resolve down by a half step to the first scale degree. So it's a different resolution because we're going to a different chord. And then, of course, we'd have, and then 2. Okay, so 2 ways to prepare to introduce the flat 2. You can either introduce it as an upper chromatic neighbor, or you can introduce it as a descending whole step from the third scale degree. And then 2 different ways to resolve it based on what the chord after the Neapolitan 6th is. If you go to a 5 chord, that flat 2 will resolve down to the leading tone of the scale. If you're going to a 1/6/4 chord, it will resolve down by a half step to the first scale degree. Okay? Like I said, these are never exhaustive lists. There are tons of ways to do these things, right? But these are examples of the principles of smoothly introducing these foreign notes and then resolving them. So we kind of have the smooth effect of these chromatic chords. All right, so let's look at what happens in major. And so to create a Neapolitan chord in major, you have to introduce 2 chromatic notes using 2 chromatic patterns. Okay? So you have to introduce both the flat 2, which we worked on a second ago, and the flat 6. And you do these in the same way as before. So the flat 6 is introduced just like with borrowed chords. So now we're in the key of D major in this example. And so the flat 6 is going to be a B flat. So we can introduce that by using it as an upper neighbor to that A there. Then of course that would resolve down by step. Okay, so this isn't a Neapolitan yet because we haven't added the other part, but we do need to add the flat 6 to make it a Neapolitan. All right, and then the flat 2 is usually only introduced as a chromatic upper neighbor, so it's really hard to move down from the third scale degree to the flat 2 because that would be an augmented second, and that's usually not a good thing in this style of music. So instead, I think we'll almost always be introducing the flat 2 in major as a chromatic upper neighbor to the first scale degree. Okay, so that D, which is the tonic of the scale, goes up by a half step to E flat, and then of course it will resolve, like before, to the leading tone of the key of D major, which is C sharp. Okay, so here's what this sounds like in major. Pretty jarring, I think, right? So that's why we don't often hear it in a major key. I like it personally, but it does involve, borrowing 2 chromatic notes, and the more notes you borrow that are outside of the key, right, the more jarring and unsmooth the effect is, right? So it's only used, I think, in special circumstances, but it's a really nice effect, I think. Okay, so to summarize, to introduce the flat 2, you can do it just like you do with the borrowed notes, right? So either as a chromatic upper neighbor that resolves down to the leading tone, or a whole step that moves from the third scale degree down by a whole step. And then they either resolve to the leading tone if you're going to the 5 chord, or they resolve down by a half step to the tonic if you're going to a 1/6/4. Okay, so some examples in little snippets like we did before. Oh, this is a lot bigger than last time. I don't know how that happened. Anyway, so in this first example, we're going to be in the key of D minor. Okay, and you always want to follow the figured bass because that will tell you where the chromatic notes are. So our chromatic note is going to be in the second chord here. Okay, so it's going to be a flat 6, but that flat 6 is relative to this G, so it's going to be an E flat. So we need to find a way to smoothly introduce an E flat to this example. Okay, and so the E flat is closest to D, and D is the home key, right? The tonic of D minor. So we can introduce this flat note as an upper chromatic neighbor to D. So put that in the alto voice. And then we can go ahead and resolve it because we see that in the next chord we have a root position chord built on A, which is the 5 chord of this key. So this E flat will go to the leading tone of D, which is C sharp. Okay. Now the other things we need to do are fill out the rest of this harmony here. So this also needs a third. So we'll put the third maybe in the tenor voice here, B flat. And then we'll have that resolve back down to the A. So we'll double the A with the tenor. And then it's always a good idea to double the bass note. So maybe our soprano can create some contrary motion with the bass. And then here we don't really have any other choice but to go to an E. So we'll do that. A little bit of a leap, but that's okay. That stem straighter there. Okay, so there is a good progression. Now let's analyze that. So this first chord here is a first inversion chord. The root is D, so this is going to be a 1 chord. The second chord here, this has a lowered second scale degree and it's in first inversion, so this is our Neapolitan 6. And then of course over here we have our 5 chord. Let's erase that errant 3 there. There we go. Okay, great. So let me play this for you. There we go. Now let's look at this next one. This is in the key of A major. And then I noticed that our second chord here has a flat 6 and a natural. So that natural, of course, means natural 3. Okay. So flat 6 above that D is going to be a B flat. Okay. And then natural 3 above that D is going to be an F natural. Okay. Now this is the key of A, so that B flat is actually the lowered second degree of the scale, right? And that F natural is actually the lowered 6th degree of the scale. So this chord has both the lowered 6 and the lowered 2, so this is our Neapolitan, all right? So let's figure out first how to introduce our lowered 6th degree, which is F natural. Now one way, of course, was to use it as an upper neighbor. And so it would be an upper neighbor to the 5th scale degree, which would be E, but the problem is that doesn't exist in this chord. Okay, so we need a different way to introduce it. So another way you can introduce flat 6 is as a chromatic passing tone from the major scale degree, right, which is F sharp. So what we can do to introduce it is have our F sharp in the tenor move down to be an F natural in the next chord. Okay, and that will continue its descent until we get to an E here in our tenor. Okay, so we're introducing it as a chromatic passing tone from F sharp. Okay, now we need to find a place for our B flat to go, our lowered 2nd degree, and that is closest to our alto. Okay, and we'll introduce it as a, it's major, so the only way we can really introduce it is as a chromatic upper neighbor to A. So we'll have our B flat here. And then that, of course, will resolve to the leading tone of the key, which is G sharp. Okay, and so far we have and then we need to write our soprano line. Always good to double the bass. So we want to maybe sustain our D in the next chord. And then here, this calls for a 7th, which is actually a D as well. So we could have our soprano, a compelling melody, stay on the D there. All right. So if we were to analyze this, this chord here is a root position triad built on D. So that is the 4 chord of A. This chord here, like we said, has our flat 2 and our flat 6. So this is our Neapolitan 6. And over here, this is a seventh chord built on E in the bass. So this is our 5, 7. All right, so here's this whole thing. And then of course it was resolved to. Yeah. All right. So there you go. That's a demonstration of how to introduce flat 2. So, as a non-chord tone pattern, which creates the smoothest effect when you're incorporating that note. Okay. Thanks for watching. If you have any questions about this, ask in the Zoom session or you can email me. Otherwise, have a great day.